Welcome. My name is Alexander Ramat, and today I want to show you some of my research for my PhD thesis, where I developed an index for mobility. And I want to start with the core concept, an index for mobility. And on my journey to constructing this index, I had to answer a couple of questions. And first, with the concept of mobility itself, there is the question, what is mobility? And it's the exact same phenomena in Germany, where we have a lot of different meaning for the concept of mobility. So before I could make or construct an index and a tool for mobility, I had to first define it. What is mobility? And secondly, what influences mobility? Which different parts of the world influences our mobility? And the second major factor was the index itself. So even if I know what mobility is and I have a definition for mobility, I then have to answer the question how to measure these influencing factors of mobility and how to evaluate them. Because it's not like a physical phenomena like traffic where we can just go out and measure it. No, mobility is like a social construct, and there it's way more difficult to measure and especially to evaluate it. And today I want to show you my answers to these questions, and hopefully you can get a feeling for what challenges we have to overcome if we develop tools for mobility planning. So let's start with mobility. For me, I decided to use the mobility definition of social science, where we have mobility as a subjective space of opportunity. So mobility that is something in our head, not something that is moving around. That's the transport, the traffic part. No, mobility as a subjective space of opportunity who decides what we do, how we go out, if we drive by the car, if we drive by the bicycle, or if we stay at home and don't produce traffic at all. That's all part of mobility, and that's what's important for me for the mobility index to get as a concept. Secondly, mobility here is a decision-making filter between the basic need, for example, going out and eating pizza, and the change of location. So I can decide if I take the bus and drive to the restaurant in the city center, or if I order a pizza and it gets delivered to me at home, or if I stay at home and just have a pizza from my refrigerator. So we have different decision-making filters there that decide if I produce traffic and which traffic I produce. And the third important part is, I also grabbed that from social science, and that mobility is a result not only of structural and individual factors, but also of social cultural factors. And therefore, a mobility index has to evaluate all three of these dimensions. So, and that brings me to the next part, the next question, what influences our mobility? Because that's really important for my index to understand and evaluate then. So firstly, of course, we have the structural framework conditions, I call them. That's all the structures that are around us, the infrastructures, the streets, but also the cityscapes, the landscapes, the distances, the accessibility, everything that is built around us and defines if we even can drive to the city center by the bus and eat a pizza. So it's all dependent on the structural framework conditions. But that's only one dimension. The second dimension is the individual preconditions. So if I'm even able to take the bus to the city center, what is my health condition? What is my financial situations? What is my mobility access cards? Do I have a driving license? Do I have a bicycle? Do I have even a car to go around? All these are individual preconditions that influences, of course, my subjective space of opportunity. And then there's a third really important dimension that's often get neglected in classical transportation research and planning, and these I call the personal dispositions. These are like norms, but also socialized socialized habits, different patterns, decision patterns that influences, for example, with Flixcam, where I decide to not take the plane, maybe even though I maybe live right next to the airport and I also have the financial resources, I decide to take the train for 2 days straight to get to a conference and not take the plane because my normative frameworks forbids me to take this kind of transport mode. And we have these personal dispositions all over the place, and that's really important for our mobility, that influences our personal mobility behavior. And these three main dimensions for me are the core for our subjective opportunity spaces, and therefore are the core to understand if we want to measure and evaluate mobility. So for me, what's important for mobility evaluation, I took some theory-based assumptions and translated them for my index in methodical conclusions. First one is mobility as an opportunity space. What this means for the index is that the variety of options promotes mobility. So it's not about how long or how often I go out and travel. It's about how many options I have to go from A to B. Yeah, if I have different modes I can choose, so I have a bigger opportunity space. That's really important. Then secondly, mobility is subjective. That's important for the index because it's a relative index I constructed, and mobility, in my opinion, can only be accessed in relative terms. So we don't have absolute values like a minimum or maximum or like a physical measurements like traffic flow or something like that. Mobility is only in relative disposition to each other. So if we want to measure mobility, it really depends which area of research we choose, and depending on this area, the mobility index should change. And third, mobility is a normative construct. As I already told, it's not like a physical construct. We have to define and normative construct mobility. So we have to say what is a good mobility, what is a bad mobility. There's not like high natural highs or lows. So that's why I decided to construct an index for mobility, the same as for human development of the United Nations, or press freedom, or perceived corruption, or happiness of life. All these normative constructs, which are really hard to evaluate, indices are like the perfect tool to evaluate. So let me cite myself from my PhD thesis. So the main point is the fewer perceived opportunities and options available to an individual, the lower is his or her mobility. And that's a stark contrast to some of other definitions of high mobility and low mobility. So here it's really important to underscore that's here it's about opportunities and options, and not about traveling or travel time or the number of travels I do a day. So secondly, I was constructing now this index based on this normative framework. From data values, I translated these three sub-dimensions of mobility in sub-indices. So we have the mobility index in the end. We have three sub-indices before, and then we have core indicators. I will show them to you in the next slides, which construct these sub-indices. And it's really important to understand that these are based on mobility research all over the world. I made a meta-analysis of all different kind of studies and analysis where there was like scientific evidence that these core indicators influences this part of mobility. And then I took them for my index. Yes, and of course there's also a weighting method possible here that we can use on the level of the core indicators, but I will go into detail anymore here. And I also will show you only very brief the basic formulas. I think it's important to show them, but of course I don't have the time to explain everything here. What you see on the top left is just the normalization, where we transform the values, which are quite different from inhabitants per square kilometer or like on a Likert scala, how happy are you with your living conditions. They all have to be transformed in the same scale. So I do it with a minimum maximum scale, and that's why the lowest value I have from all the in the research area gets a 1, the highest value get the 2, and every other value gets scale in between these two. That's why that's the relative part of my mobility index, where there's always a scale from 1 to 2, so we always can see the difference in the opportunity spaces. And the other formulas are just like this geometric means I built from these indicators. I combine the measurement indicators to core indicators, and the core indicators then through these 3 subdimensions, as we can see here under the triple root. We have this products of this structural framework conditions, the individual preconditions, and the personal dispositions, and then they all get combined together, and again a geometric mean to the mobility index. And then we have mobility, a lot of mobility index for different parts to evaluate. But I will maybe let me explain with a map. So I did the first mobility index in a district of Berlin, in Pankow. It has like 400,000 inhabitants, so it's like a city itself. And we have in the south really dense populated areas, in the north really low populated areas. And here you can see it's 59 areas, and we have 59 mobility indices from 39% to 62% in the south. And now I want to show you some of these indicators who influences why some of these have a higher mobility index and some of these has a lower. So the first example is the sub-area of the Kollwitzplatz in the south, is highly dense urban area with 5-story buildings and really dense packed streets. Secondly, it's the exact opposite, Blankenfelde in the north. It's really rural. It's the suburban rural area with a lot of fields and agriculture, but also small villages. And the third are Karobuch. It's like a mixed city structure. It's quite peripheral, but it still has partially dense areas. So the first dimension was a structural framework conditions, and here I used 3 main dimensions who influences this dimension as accessibility, settlement structure, and environmental impact. As we can see here with in comparison, the first and the second sub-area, where there's quite a difference as we would expect. Blankenfelde here with the last place on two of these core indicators of population density and job density. So it's just a classical rural area. And in comparison, we have here really walkable and highly public transport accessible sub-district in the south with the Kollwitzplatz. So of course the emission pollution is a little bit better out in the suburbs, but not as much. So as we can see here, the southern district, of course, in the structural framework conditions has way better conditions for mobility. In the second dimension, the individual preconditioned, I analyzed transport access, social demographic characteristic, and social networks. And as we can see here, this was quite an unexpected for me that this peripheral sub-district in the north had quite high values here, especially in access to public transport, which I was not expecting. Of course, I was expecting a high car dependency and high car access, but not as high access to public transport. So as we can see here, a theory I have is that the people there who are living there have really low structures around them, so they have a high individual responsibility to keep their mobility high, and that's why they take part in a lot of different societal participation and social activities, so that they can keep their mobility level high even though they live in a quite peripheral area. So this was quite unexpected. And in the third dimension, the personal disposition, I analyzed the perceived accessibility, the residential perception, and the social perception. And there we see in the third sub area, which is on the one hand quite peripheral and from the structures also not optimal, but as we can see here, it was quite above the median with a really good perceived accessibility, even though it was a peripheral, and a high life satisfaction and family contact in this area. So the people were quite happy where their perceived accessibility and mobility in this area, which was also quite unexpected. And as you can see, it's really important to analyze all of these 3 dimensions of mobility. And here you can see 3 maps with these 3 sub-dimensions, and as you can see, they are quite different. So it's not like the structures are the same as the individual preconditions and the disposition. Sorry, the maps are still in German marked, but as you can see, the left one is the structures, in the center we have the individual preconditions, and on the right as the dispositions, and we see stark contrast there. Of course, we expect on the left in the dense suburban area, it looks more like an accessibility map, which it mostly is. So this is quite expected, that in the north, where there's a lot of suburban and rural areas, quite bad, and the south is really good. But in the other maps, we can see there's like different divides there, and that's really important to understand all of these 3 dimensions for mobility. And therefore, we got 3 different indices for mobility. Kollwitzplatz was still the best area with 36%, and Blankenfelde was the last, even though they have really good preconditions. The structures and dispositions were quite bad there, so it's only 39%, but still it could be way worse. And Caro Buch, even though they are quite peripheral, have really good values of 52 and 51%. So that was my conclusions. So in the last slide, I want to show some key findings I found, and which I think is important if you are trying to construct yourself some tools for mobility, for understanding mobility. So first is, it's important to identify and evaluate all 3 dimensions of mobility. I think it's especially in practitioners, there's mostly where mobility is just transport or traffic. So for me, it's really important, and to also tell all the people, politicians and practitioners, that mobility is more than just traffic or transport. It's more. It's like the dispositions, like the individual part. So all 3 dimensions are important for understanding mobility. Secondly, therefore, an interdisciplinary approach is needed. So it's not enough to understand accessibility planning, or it's not enough to just do social mobility research. You have to combine them. Yeah? And that's why I think the index is a good method for that, because it can combine quite different data sets with each other and generate some overarching integrated evaluation approach. The third one is that transportation planning itself. I'm coming from transportation planning science, so they need more practitioner with expertise in these qualitative and interdisciplinary methods. Yeah? That's still quite scientific, and it's really hard. We're working together in Berlin with a lot of these planning practitioners, but it's really hard to bring these methods to them, and they adapt these thinking strategies and solution strategies for their daily work. So that's a long way to go, and we all have to work together to bring this knowledge from research also in the practice. And that's the fourth part. We need a research field itself for mobility planning, because what I always find is we have a lot of mobility research and we have this transport planning, and there's really only a small part of interconnectivity and interdisciplinary exchange. And it's really important for the future of transportation planning that we bring in the knowledge from mobility research to the practitioners who developed our cities, our streets, etc. So that's important. That's why what I'm working on, and I hope with my mobility index that I can make some example how we can evaluate mobility for planning practice. And in the future, I hope we will develop a lot of more tools and instruments to shaping our future mobility. Thank you a lot.